The first light of dawn crept through the barracks windows, casting long shadows across the polished concrete floor. Sergeant Elena Ramirez sat on the edge of her narrow bunk, her desert combat boots unlaced, staring at the duffel bag that contained 5 years of her life. Beside her shadow a magnificent German shepherd with coal-black fur and intelligent amber eyes lay, with his massive head resting on his paws, watching her every movement with an intensity that made her chest tighten. Fingers trembled as she folded her final uniform, the one she'd worn yesterday during the farewell ceremony. The fabric still held the scent of the Afghan dust that had become as familiar as her own breath. Shadow's ears twitched at the rustling sound, and he lifted his head, those golden eyes searching her face with an understanding that transcended words. "Easy boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the pre-dawn silence, but even as she spoke she could feel the tremor in her own voice. The crack in the armor she'd spent years building the barracks around them buzzed with the quiet efficiency of soldiers preparing for another day. Boots echoed in the hallway, voices murmured orders and jokes, the coffee pot gurgled in the common area. It was the rhythm Elena had known for half a decade, a symphony of military life that had become her heartbeat. Tomorrow, she would wake up in her childhood bedroom in San Antonio, and the silence would be deafening. Shadow rose to his feet with fluid grace, his powerful frame moving to sit directly in front of her. At 90 pounds of solid muscle and unwavering loyalty, he was an intimidating presence to enemies, but to Elena, he was simply her partner, her family, her anchor in a world that often felt like it was spinning out of control. She reached out and ran her fingers through his thick fur, feeling the familiar scars from their deployments. A nick in his left ear from shrapnel in Kandahar, a raised line along his shoulder from a close call with an IED. Each mark told a story, and Elena knew every single one. "You remember that night in Sector 7? She asked quietly, her hand moving to scratch behind his ears in the spot that always made him lean into her touch. "When that insurgent came around the corner, and you took him down before I even saw him coming." Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor, and Elena could swear she saw understanding in his eyes. Dogs didn't smile, she knew that, but somehow, Shadow managed to convey joy anyway. In the tilt of his head, the way his ears perked forward, the gentle rumble in his chest, that was almost like a perth. The memories came flooding back, unbidden. Their first mission together, when Shadow was still learning her scent, her rhythm, her commands. She'd been so nervous, fresh out of canine handler training, assigned to one of the most experienced dogs in the unit. Everyone told her Shadow was special, that he had an instinct for danger that had saved countless lives. What they didn't tell her was that he would also have an instinct for healing the broken parts of her soul she didn't even know existed. She remembered the long nights on patrol when the only sounds were their synchronized breathing and the distant call of desert winds. Shadow walking, point his nose, working constantly, his entire body, a finely tuned instrument designed to keep her alive. She remembered the way he would position himself between her and any perceived threat, how he would press against her leg during incoming mortar fire, a solid warm presence that reminded her she wasn't alone in the chaos. The sound of approaching footsteps made both Elena and Shadow's heads turn toward the door, heavy boots moving with purpose. Elena's stomach dropped as she recognized the gate commander Hartwell, making his morning rounds. She'd been dreading this moment for weeks, ever since her discharge papers had been finalized. "Ramirez." The commander's voice cut through the morning quiet. As he appeared in the doorway, Colonel James Hartwell was a career soldier weathered by 3 decades of service, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. He was fair, but firm, and Elena respected him immensely, which was exactly why what he was about to say would hurt so much. Sir. Elena rose to her feet, and Shadow immediately moved to her side, sitting at perfect attention. Even in the informal setting of the barracks, military protocol was muscle memory. Hartwell's expression was carefully neutral, but Elena caught the flicker of something, regret, maybe, or sympathy, that crossed his features before he spoke. "Your transport leaves at 0800. 20 minutes. Lena nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She'd known this was coming, had been preparing for it, but somehow hearing the finality in his words made it real in a way that all the paperwork and ceremonies hadn't. And Shadow, she asked, though she already knew the answer. Hartwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Shadow will be reassigned to Corporal Williams. He's been briefed on Shadow's protocols and medical history. The transition should be smooth." The words hit Elena like physical blows. Reassigned transition, as if Shadow were a piece of equipment instead of a living, breathing creature who had chosen to trust her with his life countless times, as if the bond they'd forged in fire and fear could be transferred as easily as signing papers. Shadow seemed to sense the shift in the conversation. His body tensed and he moved closer to Elena, his shoulder pressing against her leg. When she looked down at him, those amber eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath. "She's a good dog," Hartwell continued, his voice softer. "Now, one of the best we've had. Williams will take good care of him." Elena wanted to scream that Williams didn't know how. Shadow liked his ears scratched, didn't know that he was afraid of helicopters, but would face down armed insurgents without hesitation. Williams hadn't spent 3 years learning to read every twitch of Shadow's tail, every shift in his posture that signaled danger or comfort, or the simple need for reassurance. That she nodded again, her throat too tight to speak. Hartwell studied her for a moment, and Elena thought she saw her own pain reflected in his weathered features. He'd been in the military long enough to know what it meant to say goodbye to a partner, to leave behind pieces of yourself in service to dutify. Minutes, Sergeant, he said finally, then turned and walked away, leaving Elena alone with Shadow and the weight of an impossible goodbye. Elena sank back down onto her bunk, and Shadow immediately moved to sit between her knees, his head resting against her chest. She buried her face in his fur, breathing in his familiar scent, dry desert air, military soap, and something distinctly shadowed that no amount of time or distance would ever erase from her memory. "I'm so sorry," she whispered against his neck. "I'm so sorry." But as she held him, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the solid warmth of his body, Elena realized that Shadow wasn't just accepting this goodbye. His muscles were coiled with tension, his ears were pinned back, and when she pulled away to look at his face, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip: determination, defiance. The same look he got when he detected a threat and prepared to protect her at any cost. Shadow might not understand military orders or discharge papers, but he understood loyalty, and as Elena gathered her belongings and prepared to walk out of his life forever, she couldn't shake the feeling that her four-legged partner had other plans entirely. Elena's hands shook as she shouldered her duffel bag, the weight of it nothing compared to the crushing pressure in her chest. Around her, the barracks had come alive with the morning routine, soldiers rushing to formation, the clatter of gear being checked and rechecked, the constant hum of military efficiency. But for Elena, time seemed to move in slow motion, each second stretching out like an eternity. Shadow hadn't moved from her side as she stood. He rose with her, his massive frame staying within inches of her legs. When she took a step toward the door, he moved with her, perfectly synchronized as they'd been for 3 years. The sight of it nearly broke her resolve entirely. "Come on, boy," she said softly, forcing her feet to carry her toward the exit. "Let's go say goodbye." Properly, the morning air hit them as they stepped outside, crisp and clean with the promise of another scorching desert day. Ahead, the base was in full swing, vehicles rumbling past, soldiers calling out orders, the distant whir of helicopter blades cutting through the air. It was a symphony. Elena had grown to love the sound of purpose and mission and belonging, but today, it felt like a funeral march. Elena led Shadow to their favorite small area behind the K9 training facility where they'd spent countless hours working on commands, building trust, simply existing together in comfortable silence. It was here that Shadow had first looked at her with something more than professional respect, where she'd first realized that this dog wasn't just her partner, but her family. She remembered that first deployment like it was yesterday, though it had been nearly 3 years ago. She'd been so green, so eager to prove herself, clutching Shadow's leash with sweaty palms as they prepared for their first patrol together. Sergeant Martinez, her predecessor, had given her exactly 2 minutes of advice before shipping out. "Trust the dog, he knows things you don't." At the time, Elena had thought it was just typical military wisdom, vague, gruff, and not particularly helpful. She'd undergone months of training, studied canine behavior, memorized every protocol and procedure. How much could a dog really know that she didn't? The answer, as it turned out, was everything that mattered. Their first mission had been routine reconnaissance, checking an abandoned compound for weapons caches. Elena had been nervous running through her mental checklist when Shadow had suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His ears had gone flat against his head, his body had tensed, and he'd let out a low growl that raised every hair on Elena's arm. She had almost ignored it. The compound looked empty, her equipment showed no signs of danger, and they were behind schedule. But something in Shadow's posture, the way his hackles had risen along his spine, made her trust her partner over her instrument. That called for backup and waited. 20 minutes later, explosive ordnance disposal had found an IED buried just 10 feet from where Shadow had stopped, exactly where Elena would have stepped if they'd continued forward that night. Back in the barracks, Elena had sat on the floor next to Shadow's bed, running her hands through his fur as the reality of what had almost happened settled in. Shadow had saved her life on their very first mission together, and he'd done it not because of training or orders, but because he'd decided she was worth protecting. "Thank you," she'd whispered to him in the darkness, and Shadow had moved closer, resting his head on her lap in a gesture of acceptance that had sealed their bond forever. Now, sitting in that same quiet space behind the training facility, Elena felt the weight of all the missions that had followed. The night patrols through hostile territory with Shadow's nose working constantly, his entire body a finely tuned early warning system. The times he'd detected improvised explosive devices before her equipment even registered a threat. The ambush in Sector 12 when insurgents had tried to flank their patrol, and Shadow had taken down 2 armed fighters before Elena had even realized they were under attack. But it wasn't just the dramatic moments that had bound them together, it was the quiet times. Tooth away, Shadow would settle next to her during incoming mortar fire, a steady presence in the chaos. How he'd learned to read her moods, pressing against her leg. When nightmares woke her in the middle of the night, the way he'd sit perfectly still while she cleaned his wounds, trusting her completely even when it hurt. You remember that sandstorm in March? Elena asked, her voice barely audible over the distant sounds of the base. Shadow's ears perked up at her voice, and he moved closer, his amber eyes fixed on her face. We got separated from the patrol, couldn't see 2 feet in front of us. You found that cave kept us safe for 6 hours until the storm passed. Shadow's tail thumped once against the ground, and Elena could swear she saw recognition in his intelligent eyes. Dogs lived in the moment, everyone said, but Elena knew better. Shadow remembered. He remembered every mission, every shared danger, every quiet moment when it had been just the 2 of them against the world. The sound of approaching voices made both Elena and Shadow turn. A group of soldiers was walking toward them, Elena's squadmates coming to say their own goodbyes. Among them was Corporal Danny Williams, a good soldier but young, maybe 23, with earnest eyes and a nervous energy that made Elena's stomach clench. Williams was Shadow's new handler. "Hey," Ramirez called out Sergeant Mike Thompson, a grizzled veteran, who'd taken Elena under his wing when she'd first arrived. "Heard you were shipping out this morning." Lena rose to her feet, and Shadow immediately moved to stand beside her, his shoulder touching her leg. "Yeah, transport leaves in 10 minutes." The group gathered around them, and Elena saw the mix of emotions on their faces. Sadness at losing a good soldier, excitement for her new life, and underneath it all, the discomfort of watching a bond that ran deeper than most human relationships come to an end. Williams stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back in a formal posture that screamed of nervous energy. "I want you to know, I'll take good care of him," he said, his voice earnest and young. "I've read all the reports, studied his protocols. I know how important he is." Elena appreciated the sentiment. She really did. Williams was a good kid with good intentions, but as she looked at him, all she could think about was how he didn't know that Shadow was scared of thunderstorms, but would brave gunfire without hesitation. He didn't know that Shadow had a favorite spot behind his left ear where he liked to be scratched, or that he could detect Elena's anxiety before she even realized she was feeling it. "He's a good dog," Elena managed to say, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. "The best partner I've ever had." Williams nodded seriously, as if he were receiving a sacred trust, which Elena supposed he was. "Come on, boy," Williams said, reaching for Shadow's leash. "Let's get you settled in." But Shadow wasn't interested in Martinez's reassurances. His amber eyes were fixed on Elena's face with laser intensity, and she could read his message as clearly as if he'd spoken. He wasn't going back in that cage, and he wasn't letting her leave him again. "How did he get out?" Elena asked, examining the kennel gate more closely. The latch mechanism was intact, but somehow, Shadow had managed to work it open from the inside. Martinez shook his head in amazement. "These kennels are designed to hold the strongest military working dogs. I've never seen one opened from the inside." Before Elena knelt down beside Shadow, running her hands over his powerful frame, checking for injuries from his escape, but he seemed unharmed, just determined and alert in a way that reminded her of their most dangerous missions together. "You brilliant boy," she whispered, unable to keep the admiration out of her voice. "But this isn't going to help anything. They'll just put you in a stronger condition." If summoned by her words, the sound of running feet echoed across the night air. Within minutes, the K-9 facility was swarming with personnel. Dr. Chen arriving with her medical bag, Williams stumbling out of his barracks and hastily thrown on clothes, and behind them, Commander Hartwell, looking like a man whose patience was wearing dangerously thin wets. "The situation?" Hartwell demanded, his steel gray eyes taking in the scene. The damaged kennel. Shadow pressed against Elena's legs, Martinez standing helplessly with his flashlight. "The dog escaped from his kennel," Sir Martinez reported. "Found Sergeant Ramirez here trying to calm him down." Hartwell's gaze shifted to Elena, and she could see the questions forming behind his weathered features. "And what were you doing at the K-9 facility at 0200 hours? Sergeant Elena straightened, meeting her commander's gaze directly. "I heard a dog in distress, sir. I came to investigate it." Wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either, and she suspected Hartwell knew it. The commander studied her for a long moment, then turned his attention to Shadow, who remained pressed against Elena's legs like a furry bodyguard. "Dr. Chen," Hartwell said finally, "professional assessment." Dr. Chen approached slowly, her movements careful and non-threatening as she observed Shadow's posture and behavior. The dog watched her warily, but didn't show any signs of aggression. His focus remained entirely on Elena's severe separation anxiety. Dr. Chen said, after a moment, combined with what appears to be problem-solving intelligence that allowed him to escape a supposedly secure enclosure. "This level of distress isn't sustainable, Commander. If we continue trying to force the separation, we risk permanent psychological damage." Williams stepped forward, his young face flushed with embarrassment and frustration. "Sir, I've tried everything. I've followed every protocol, used every technique," Dr. Chen suggested, "but he won't even look at me." When Sergeant Ramirez is in the room, Elena's heart went out to the young soldier. This wasn't his fault. He was a good handler trying to bond with a dog who had already given his heart completely to someone else. "Perhaps," Dr. Chen said carefully, We should consider that some bonds simply can't be transferred. Military working dogs are bred and trained for loyalty. But occasionally that loyalty becomes so focused, so absolute that it can't be redirected. Hartwell's expression remained unreadable, but Elena caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was calculating costs and benefits, weighing regulations against reality. But military has invested significant resources in this animal, he said finally. Shadow has years of useful service remaining. We can't simply write off that investment because he's having adjustment difficulties with respect, Sir Elena said, her voice stronger than she felt. Shadow has already given the military 6 years of distinguished service. He's completed over 200 successful missions, saved countless lives, and earned multiple commendations. If he were a human soldier with that record, we'd be talking about medals and honors, not forcing him into situations that cause him to seemed to sense the tension in her voice because he pressed closer to her legs, his warm weight a familiar comfort in the midst of an impossible situation. Sergeant Ramirez, Hartwell said coldly, you are out of line. This is not a negotiation. And Shadow, he's not a human soldier, he is military equipment, and he will be treated as such. The words hit Elena like physical blows, but before she could respond, something extraordinary happened. Shadow stepped away from her legs and moved to stand directly in front of Hartwell, his amber eyes fixed on the commander's face with unmistakable intelligence. For a moment the two stared at each other, the career military officer and the decorated working dog, and Elena could swear she saw understanding pass between them. Shadow wasn't cowering or showing submission. He was making eye contact with the superior officer, demanding to be seen as more than equipment geniuses. Martinez breathed, his voice barely audible. He knows what we're talking about. Dr. Chen stepped closer, her professional curiosity overriding the tension of the moment. Military working dogs are incredibly intelligent, but this level of contextual understanding is unusual. Shadow isn't just responding to emotional cues, he's demonstrating cognitive processing that suggests he understands the conversation is about his future. Hartwell continued to stare down at Shadow, and Elena held her breath, waiting for her commander's response. Around them the desert night seemed to hold its breath, as well the usual sounds of the base fading into silence. Finally Shadow broke the stalemate. He turned away from Hartwell and walked back to Elena, sitting down directly at her feet in a perfect military posture, back straight, head up, eyes alert. But his message was unmistakable. He had made his choice, and no amount of military protocol was going to change it. One more day, Dr. Chen said quietly, breaking the tense silence. Give me one more day to work with them. If I can't facilitate a successful transition by tomorrow night, then we'll know we're dealing with a bond that can't be broken by conventional methods. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for Hartwell's response. She could see him weighing options, calculating the costs of various choices, trying to balance military efficiency with the reality of what he was witnessing. One more day, Hartwell said finally. But if Shadow can't adapt to Corporal Williams by 2100 hours tomorrow, then we'll be discussing more permanent solutions. The words sent a chill down Elena's spine. More permanent solutions could mean anything from early retirement to euthanasia, and she realized with crystal clarity that Shadow's life hung in the balance of her ability to convince him to accept a new partner. As the group began to disperse, Dr. Chen approached Elena with an expression of concern. I need you to understand something, she said quietly. Shadow isn't just being stubborn. This level of attachment, this kind of absolute loyalty, actually a sign of superior intelligence and emotional capacity, but it also means that if he can't adapt, if the separation becomes too traumatic. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Elena understood perfectly. Dogs could die of broken hearts, just like humans, and Shadow had made it clear that his heart belonged entirely to her. What do I do? Elena asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Chen studied Shadow, who remained sitting at Elena's feet like a furry guardian. Honestly, I don't know. I've never seen a bond this strong in all my years of working with military animals. Tomorrow we'll try everything in the book, but I can't promise it will be enough. As they walked back toward the barracks, Shadow padding silently beside Elena, she realized that the next 24 hours would determine not just Shadow's future, but her own as well. Because looking down at her four-legged partner, seeing the absolute trust in his amber eyes, Elena knew with growing certainty that she couldn't abandon him, even if it meant abandoning everything else. The base was quiet now, the night settling around them like a blanket, but Elena's mind was racing with possibilities, with plans, with the desperate hope that somehow, someway she could find a solution that would save the partner who had saved her so many times. Shadow looked up at her as they walked, his tail wagging once in quiet contentment, and Elena realized that he wasn't worried about tomorrow. He was confident that she would find a way to keep them together. The question was, could she live up to that faith? The standoff lasted exactly 37 seconds. Elena knew because she was counting her heartbeats, and they were coming fast and hard. As Shadow stood directly in her path, his amber eyes locked on hers with unwavering determination. Around them, her squadmates shifted uncomfortably, uncertain how to intervene in a moment that felt far too personal for military protocol. Shadow, move, Elena commanded, her voice carrying the authority of 3 years of partnership. It was a tone Shadow had never disobeyed a voice that had guided him through countless missions and saved both their lives. More times than she could count, Shadow's ears twitched at the familiar command, and for a moment, Elena thought he might comply, but then he sat down heavily in front of her, his massive frame blocking her path to the transport vehicle, and the message was unmistakable. He wasn't moving, and she wasn't leaving without him. Jesus, Thompson muttered under his breath, running a hand through his graying hair. I've never seen anything like this. Williams stepped forward again, his young face flushed with embarrassment and determination. I can handle this, Sergeant Ramirez. He just needs time to adjust. But when Williams reached for Shadow's leash, the dog's lips pulled back in a warning. The snarl that made everyone take a step backward. It wasn't the controlled aggression of a military working dog. It was the primal response of an animal protecting something precious. Something precious. Easy boy, Elena said quickly, moving to place herself between Shadow and Williams. The last thing she needed was for Shadow to be labeled aggressive, on top of everything else. Nobody's going to hurt. Youth radio crackled again from Thompson's belt. Final call for Sergeant Ramirez, transport departing in 2 minutes. Elena's chest tightened with panic. She could see her transport in the distance. Other soldiers loading their gear, ready to carry her away from this life forever. But Shadow sat like a furry mountain between her and her future, and she realized with growing horror that there was no easy solution to this standoff. I need to call the commander, Thompson said quietly, already reaching for his radio. Oh, Elena said quickly, give me 1 more minute. She knelt down beside Shadow, again taking his great head in her hands and forcing him to look at her. His amber eyes were bright with what she could only describe as betrayal, and the sight of it nearly destroyed her. Listen to me, she whispered, her voice shaking, despite her best efforts to stay strong. I know you don't understand why this is happening. I know it doesn't make sense to you, but Williams is a good soldier, and he'll take care of you. Shadow's tail thumped once against the ground, but his expression didn't change. If anything, he seemed to press closer to her, his warm breath against her cheek, a reminder of all the quiet moments they'd shared. You saved my life so many times, Elena continued, her voice breaking now. I need you to save yourself. I need you to be a good dog and go with Williams, because if you don't, she couldn't finish the sentence. They both knew what happened to military working dogs who were deemed unfit for service, but Shadow just stared at her with those knowing eyes, and Elena realized that he understood more than she'd given him credit for. He knew this was goodbye. He knew she was leaving him behind, and he was making a choice about what kind of dog he wanted to be. Sound of approaching vehicles made everyone turn. Commander Hartwell was striding toward them, his face set in the grim expression Elena had learned to associate with difficult decisions. Behind him walked Captain Sarah Chen, the base veterinarian, and to military police officers whose presence sent a chill down Elena's spine. What's the situation here? Hartwell demanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Thompson stepped forward, his posture snapping to attention. Sir, the dog is refusing to cooperate with the transition. He won't leave Sergeant Ramirez's side. Hartwell studied the scene. Elena, kneeling beside Shadow, Williams standing helplessly with an unused leash, the gathered soldiers watching with expressions of sympathy and concern. His weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts. Sergeant Ramirez, your transport is waiting, he said finally. Yes, sir, Elena replied, rising to her feet. I understand the situation, and I'm working to resolve it. The situation, Hartwell said coldly, is that military protocol is being disrupted by a dog who refuses to accept his new assignment. This is exactly why the military has regulations about emotional attachments to working animals. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice level with respect. Sir, Shadow isn't just being stubborn. He's responding to a traumatic separation from his primary handler. Dr. Chen can tell you that this kind of behavior is documented in cases where military working dogs have formed exceptionally strong bonds. Dr. Chen stepped forward, her expression thoughtful as she observed Shadow's posture and body language. The sergeant has a point, Commander. This level of attachment is unusual but not unheard of. Sometimes military working dogs form bonds that go beyond standard handler relationships. Then what do you recommend, Dr. Hartwell asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer and didn't like it. Time and patience, Dr. Chen replied. Forced separation could cause lasting psychological damage that would make Shadow unsuitable for future service. Elena's heart lurched. Sir, Shadow is one of the most decorated canines south in the unit. He's saved countless lives, completed over 200 successful missions. Whatever his future assignment, he deserves better than to be written off because of one difficult transition. Hartwell's expression softened almost imperceptibly, and Lena caught a glimpse of the man behind the ranks, someone who'd spent 30 years in the military and understood the cost of duty better than most. The dog has served with distinction, he acknowledged, but military regulations exist for a reason. Sergeant, we can't allow individual attachments to disrupt the chain of command. As if summoned by the conversation, Shadow rose to his feet and moved to stand directly in front of Elena, his body language making his position unmistakably clear. When one of the MPs took a step forward, Shadow's hackles rose, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. He's protecting her, Dr. Chen observed quietly in his mind. Elena is pack, and these strangers represent a threat to that pack structure. So what do we do? Williams asked, his young voice betraying his frustration. I can't force him to bond with me if he's determined to fight it. Elena looked around at the gathered faces, her commander struggling with regulations versus compassion, her squad mates torn between sympathy and duty. Dr. Chen calculating the psychological implications, Williams trying to understand a situation that was far more complex than anything his training had prepared him for. And through it all, Shadow sat pressed against her legs, his amber eyes fixed on her face with a trust so absolute it made her chest ache. There might be another option, Elena said slowly, an idea forming in her mind. Shadow's been in service for 6 years. Most military working dogs retire after 8 to 10 years. What if we considered early retirement? Hartwell's eyebrows rose. You're suggesting the military retire a valuable working dog because he's having separation anxiety? I'm suggesting the military consider the welfare of a decorated veteran who's given 6 years of distinguished service, Elena replied, her voice growing stronger. Shadow has earned the right to choose his retirement, and he's making that choice right now. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, could feel Shadow's warmth against her legs, could sense the weight of everyone's gaze as they considered her words. That's not how the military works, Sergeant Hartwell said finally. We don't let dogs dictate policy. No, Sir. Elena agreed, but we do honor service and sacrifice. And Shadow has sacrificed more than most. As if sensing the conversation was about him, Shadow looked up at Elena, then at the gathered soldiers, then back at Elena again. His tail thumped once against the ground, not the enthusiastic wag of a happy dog, but the measured gesture of an animal making a deliberate statement. One more day, Dr. Chen said suddenly. Give me one more day to work with Shadow and Corporal Williams. If I can't facilitate a successful transition in 24 hours, then we'll revisit the retirement option. Elena's heart leaped with hope, but Hartwell was already shaking his head. Sergeant Ramirez ships out today. The longer we delay this transition, the more difficult it becomes. Then let Williams work with Shadow while I'm still here, Elena said quickly. Let me help with the transition. One day could make all the difference. Hartwell studied her for a long moment, his steel gray eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts around them. The base continued its daily rhythm. Vehicles rumbling past, soldiers calling out orders, the distant whir of helicopter blades. But for Elena, the world had narrowed to this moment, this choice, this last chance to do right by the partner who'd saved her life so many times. One day, Hartwell said finally, Dr. Chen will oversee the transition. If Shadow can't adapt to Corporal Williams by 08:00, tomorrow we'll discuss alternatives. Elena felt her knees go weak with relief, but Shadow just pressed closer to her legs as if he understood that they'd won a battle, but not the war. Thank you, sir, Elena managed to say. But as Hartwell walked away and the crowd began to disperse, Elena caught Dr. Chen's eye. The veterinarian's expression was kind, but realistic, and Elena realized with growing certainty that 24 hours wouldn't be enough to break a bond that had been forged in combat and sealed with absolute trust. Shadow looked up at her with those knowing amber eyes, and Elena had the distinct feeling that her four-legged partner understood the situation better than any of them. He wasn't planning to adapt, he was planning to wait. The makeshift barracks Elena had been assigned for her extended stay felt like a prison cell despite being identical to the room she'd called home for 3 years. She lay on the narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling, while the sounds of the base at night filtered through the thin walls, distant conversations, the rumble of vehicles, the occasional bark from the canine kennels that made her heart clench. Somewhere out there, Shadow was locked in a kennel, separated from her for the first time since they'd been partnered. The thought made her stomach twist with guilt and worry. Military working dogs were trained to be resilient, to adapt to changing circumstances. But Shadow had never been like other dogs from the moment they'd been paired. He'd shown an intuition and emotional intelligence that went far beyond his training. Elena rolled over and checked the luminous dial of her watch. 0200. Hours she'd been lying here for 4 hours sleep, an impossible dream when her mind kept cycling through the events of the day. The transition training with Williams had been a disaster. Shadow had gone through the motions, following basic commands, performing his detection work, but his heart hadn't been in it. Every few minutes he'd look around searching for Elena, and when he spotted her, his entire demeanor would change from dutiful compliance to eager attention. Williams, to his credit, had tried everything Dr. Chen suggested. He'd spent hours working with Shadow on trust exercises, had fed him treats, had attempted to establish the kind of bond that would make the transition successful, but Shadow's responses had been perfunctory at best, like a soldier following orders while his mind was elsewhere. The sound that jerked Elena from her restless thoughts was so faint she almost missed it, a distant whining that seemed to be coming from the direction of the canine facilities. She sat up listening intently and heard it again, a dog in distress, the sound pitched in a way that made every nerve in her body come alive. Shadowlena was on her feet and dressed before she'd consciously made the decision to move. She slipped out of the barracks and into the cool desert night, following the sounds that pulled at her heart like a physical force. The base was quieter now with only essential personnel on duty, and the shadows seemed deeper, more dangerous. The K-9 facility was located on the far side of the base, a cluster of buildings that housed the military working dogs when they weren't on duty. As Elena approached, the whining grew louder, more desperate, and she realized with growing certainty that Shadow was in distress. She found him in kennel number 7, a standard chain-link enclosure with a concrete floor and a raised platform for sleeping. Shadow was pacing the small space, his powerful frame moving restlessly from one end to the other, pausing occasionally to whine and scratch at the gate. When he saw Elena approaching, he pressed himself against the chain link, his amber eyes bright with something that looked remarkably like relief. "Hey boy," Elena whispered, kneeling down beside the kennel and reaching through the links to touch his nose. "What's wrong? Can't sleep either?" Shadow pressed his entire face against her hand, a rumbling whine in his chest that spoke of confusion and longing. Elena's heart broke as she realized that Shadow had probably never spent a night in a kennel. Since they'd been partnered, he'd always slept on a bed next to hers, close enough that she could reach out and touch him if nightmares woke her in the darkness. "I know, baby," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I know this is hard, but you have to try to adapt. Williams is a good soldier, and he wants to take care of you." But even as she spoke, the words Elena knew they were hollow comfort. Shadow wasn't struggling with adaptation. He was struggling with abandonment in his mind. She had simply vanished from his life without explanation, leaving him in a cage with strangers who smelled wrong and spoke in unfamiliar tones. Elena spent 20 minutes talking to him in soothing whispers, sharing memories of their missions together, reminding him of all the times he'd been brave and strong and perfect. Gradually, Shadow's pacing slowed, and he settled down next to the gate, pressing as close to Elena as the chain link would allow. "I have to go," Elena finally whispered, hating herself for the words. "But I'll see you tomorrow, okay? We'll work with Williams again, and maybe it'll be easier." But as she rose to leave, Shadow leaped to his feet, pressing against the gate with renewed urgency. His whining grew louder, more desperate, and Elena realized with dawning horror that he thought she was abandoning. "Hey Mageno baby, I'm not leaving," she said, quickly pressing her hands against the chain link. "I'm just going back to my barracks. I'll be here tomorrow." But Shadow's distress only intensified, and Elena found herself trapped between duty and compassion, between military protocol and the desperate needs of a partner who had never asked for anything except her presence. The sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and Elena heard the familiar voice of Sergeant Martinez, one of the night's security guards. "Someone there?" Martinez called out, his hand resting on his sidearm. Elena stepped into the light, raising her hands to show she was unarmed. "It's Ramirez, Sergeant. I heard one of the dogs in distress and came to check." Martinez's expression softened as he recognized her, and his flashlight beam swept over Shadow's kennel, taking in the dog's agitated state. "Poor bastard's been like this since lights out," he said quietly, pacing, whining. "Won't settle down. Dr. Chen gave him a mild sedative, but it doesn't seem to be helping." Elena's guilt intensified. Shadow had been suffering for hours, while she lay in her bunk, unable to sleep but safe and comfortable. "Has he eaten?" "Barely touched his food," Martinez replied. "Williams tried to feed him earlier, but Shadow just stared at the bowl like it was poison." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. Shadow was deteriorating, and it was her fault. She'd spent 3 years teaching him to trust her, to depend on her, to see her as the center of his world. Now she was asking him to simply forget all of that and accept a stranger in her place. "I should go," Elena said, finally, though every fiber of her being rebelled against leaving Shadow in distress. But as she turned to walk away, a sound stopped her cold, the sharp crack of metal against metal, followed by a triumphant bark. Elena spun around just in time to see Shadow pushing through the kennel gate, which was now hanging open on its hinges. "Jesus Christ," Martinez breathed, raising his flashlight to examine the gate. "How the hell did he?" But Elena wasn't listening anymore, because Shadow was free and moving toward her with single-minded determination. His powerful frame covered the distance between them in seconds, and then he was pressed against her legs, his entire body vibrating with relief and joy. "Shadow, no," Elena said weakly, even as her hands moved to stroke his fur. "You can't be out here. You have to go back to your kennel." But Shadow had no intention of going anywhere. When Martinez approached with the intention of leading him back to the damaged kennel, Shadow positioned himself directly behind Elena's legs, his hackles rising in warning. "Easy boy," Martinez said, his voice carefully neutral. "Nobody's going to hurt anybody here." But Shadow, the morning of Elena's second Dan Finaldi Proctor dawned clear and bright, the desert sun painting the base in shades of gold and amber that reminded her of Shadow's eyes. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through possibilities, strategies, Desperate plans that all seemed to crumble under the harsh light of military reality. Shadow had spent the night in a reinforced kennel, one designed to hold dogs twice his size, but Elena could hear his restless pacing, even from her barracks. Dr. Chen had worked with him and Williams for hours the previous day, trying every technique in her considerable arsenal, but the results had been heartbreakingly predictable. Shadow would perform the required tasks, follow the basic commands, but his attention remained fixed on Elena whenever she was in sight. Now, as Elena dressed in her civilian clothes for the final time on the base, she could hear the sounds of preparation echoing across the compound. Her transport would arrive at 0800 in less than 2 hours, and this time there would be no extensions, no last-minute repo. He walked slowly to Elena, his gait measured and deliberate, and when he reached her, he sat down at her feet in perfect military posture. But his amber eyes never left her face, and in their depths, Elena saw something that made her heart clench with understanding. Shadow wasn't just refusing the transfer. He was making a statement about the nature of loyalty, about bonds that transcended orders and regulations, about the kind of love that couldn't be assigned or transferred or commanded. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant sounds of the bass and the steady rhythm of Elena's heartbeat. She could feel the eyes of every person in the assembly, could sense Commander Hartwell weighing impossible choices, could practically hear Dr. Chen calculating the psychological implications of what they were witnessing. But most of all, she could feel Shadow's presence beside her, solid and warm, and absolutely unwavering in his devotion. "Commander," Elena said finally, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air, "I formally request permission to adopt K9 Shadow upon his retirement from active duty." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Elena could see Hartwell's expression shift as he processed the implications. Military working dogs could be retired early under exceptional circumstances, and there were provisions for adoption by their handlers, but the paperwork was complex and the approvals difficult to obtain. "Sergeant Ramirez," Hartwell said carefully, "such requests require extensive documentation, medical evaluations, and approval from multiple levels of command. The process can take months." "Then we'll wait," Elena said simply. "Shadow has served 6 years with distinction. He's earned the right to choose his retirement, and he's making that choice right now." Murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Elena realized that the assembled soldiers understood what was happening better than the officers. They'd all served with partners they trusted with their lives, had all experienced bonds that went beyond duty into something deeper and more personal. William stepped forward, his young face showing a mixture of disappointment and understanding. "Sir," he said quietly, "I withdraw my request. For Shadow's assignment, it's clear that this dog has already chosen his partner, and forcing the issue would be detrimental to his service." Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward the young soldier, whose generosity and wisdom far exceeded his years. Dr. Chen approached Commander Hartwell with her clipboard, speaking in low tones that Elena couldn't hear, but whose urgency was unmistakable. After several minutes of intense discussion, Hartwell turned to face the assembly, his weathered features reflecting the weight of command, in light of Shadow's exceptional service record and current psychological state. He announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the parade ground, "I am authorizing his immediate retirement from active duty effective today." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, but Elena barely heard them. She was looking down at Shadow, who remained sitting at perfect attention, his amber eyes bright with something that looked remarkably like satisfaction. Hartwell continued, raising his voice over the celebration, "I am approving Sergeant Ramirez's adoption request contingent on completion of the standard paperwork and medical clearances." Elena's ears nearly gave out with relief, but Shadow seemed to take the news as his due. He rose to his feet with dignified grace and moved to stand beside Elena, his shoulder pressing against her leg in the gesture of partnership she'd grown to love. As the ceremony dissolved into congratulations and well wishes, Elena knelt down beside Shadow and gathered his great head in her hands. "You brilliant, stubborn, impossible dog," she whispered, pressing her forehead against his. "You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you?" Shadow's tail thumped against the ground, and Elena could swear she saw amusement in his amber eyes. He'd never doubted the outcome, and never wavered in his conviction that their bond was stronger than any regulation or protocol. "We came in together," Elena said, echoing the words she'd imagined saying just 24 hours earlier, when the future had seemed so much bleaker. "And we're leaving together." Shadow's response was a gentle rumble in his chest, a sound of contentment and victory, an absolute love that spoke of new beginnings rather than endings. As Elena stood and shouldered her bag, the same duffel that had seemed so heavy with finality just hours before, Shadow moved to walk beside her, his gait matching hers with the perfect synchronization of true partners behind them. The bass continued its daily rhythm, but ahead of them lay something new, a future they would face together, just as they had faced every challenge for the past 3 years. Elena looked down at Shadow as they walked toward the transport that would carry them both home, and she realized that some bonds simply couldn't be broken by orders or regulations or the demands of duty. Some Bonds forged in fire and sealed with absolute trust were stronger than anything the world could throw at the man. As Shadow looked up at her with those knowing amber eyes, Elena understood that they had one more than just the right to stay together. They had one recognition of something the military had always known, but rarely acknowledged, that true partnership, true loyalty, true love couldn't be commanded or assigned or transferred. It could only be earned and honored and treasured for the rare and precious gift it was. Together, Sergeant Elena Ramirez and retired K-9 Shadow walked into their future, leaving behind not just their military careers, but a story that would be told in barracks and mess halls for years to come. The story of a dog who refused to leave his partner, and a system that finally learned to honor the bonds that make us all stronger. This story explores the profound bonds between military working dogs and their handlers, highlighting themes of loyalty, sacrifice, and the recognition that some relationships transcend institutional boundaries. While fictional, it draws inspiration from the real experiences of military personnel and their canine partners who served together in some of the world's most challenging environments. Didn't move his body, when rigid, every muscle tensing as Williams approached. When the young soldier reached for the leash clipped to Elena's belt, Shadow stepped backward, positioning himself directly behind Elena's legs. The group fell silent, watching as Shadow's hackles began to rise. He wasn't growling, wasn't showing teeth, but his message was crystal clear. He wasn't going anywhere. Shadow, Elena said softly, her heart breaking as she reached for his leash. It's okay, boy, go with Williams. But Shadow's amber eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was no confusion in that gaze, no uncertainty. He understood exactly what was happening, and he was making a choice. Williams tried again, moving slowly and speaking in soothing tones, but Shadow simply pressed closer to Elena, his massive frame trembling with the effort of controlled emotion. When Williams finally managed to clip a new leash to Shadow's collar, the dog planted his feet and refused to budge. Scum on Shadow, Williams coaxed, giving the leash a gentle tug. Time to go, buddy. Shadow looked from Williams to Elena, then back again. For a moment, Elena thought he might comply, might accept this new reality the way military working dogs were trained to do. But then Shadow sat down heavily right there in the dirt, and the look he gave Elena was so full of accusation and hurt that she nearly sobbed out loud. Why are you leaving me? His eyes seemed to ask, what did I do wrong? Did I do wrong? Elena knelt down beside him, gathering his massive head in her hands, pressing her forehead against his. You didn't do anything wrong, she whispered, her voice breaking despite her best efforts. You're perfect. You're the best partner anyone could ask for. But Shadow just stared at her with those knowing amber eyes, and Elena realized that all the words in the world couldn't explain military regulations to a dog who only understood loyalty. The radio crackled from Thompson's belt, breaking the tense silence. Transport for Sergeant Ramirez departing in 5 minutes. Lena closed her eyes, memorizing the feel of Shadow's fur beneath her hands, the warmth of his breath against her cheek, the solid reassurance of his presence. When she opened them again, she saw her entire squad watching her with expressions of sympathy and understanding. They all knew what this cost her. They all understood what she was losing. I have to go, Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. But as she rose to her feet and shouldered her bag, Shadow rose with her. And when she took a step toward the waiting transport, Shadow moved to block her path, his body language making his intentions unmistakably clear. He wasn't saying goodbye, he was saying no.